Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Jessica Renard. Thank you for joining us today for our Veriforce webinar on what you need to know about the OQ Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, or NPRM. We're excited to share with you the latest updates we've gotten from PHMSA's proposed changes to the OQ rule. First, let me introduce myself and our panel. As I said, I'm Jessica Renard. I'm the Product Manager for Veriforce, which is our integrated software compliance management application. I've gained knowledge on the topics we'll be discussing today from my 9 years with Veriforce, helping our clients stay in compliance with government regulations. Previous to that, I worked for a pipeline construction company as an OQ coordinator and designated employer representative for about 5 years. Tom Meek is the compliance director for Veriforce. Tom has spent 20 years in the natural gas business. He's had operations and compliance experience for Kinder Morgan and for El Paso Corporation, where he chaired El Paso's OQ committee. He's also served on various industry committees, including ASME's B31Q. We're also happy today to be joined by a former Veriforce team member, Todd Cash. Todd is now Operations and Compliance Manager for Sempra U.S. Gas and Power. He's had extensive experience with pipeline safety compliance programs with direct responsibility for those programs for 2 major gas companies. And he's also served in a consulting capacity for various compliance programs. Thanks, Todd and Tom, for joining us today. A little about Veriforce. Veriforce Solutions, just for anybody who's not familiar with Veriforce as a company, we combine software, value-added audit, consulting services, and we also offer a full suite of training. Our clients rely on us as the only single-source provider of solutions they need to enhance the safety of their workforce and the communities that they serve. Veriforce, which you'll hear me refer to throughout our webinar, is our integrated software for compliance management. This includes compliance management for operator qualification, or OQ, drug and alcohol, and safety. Our unique integrated approach allows our clients to establish and manage their compliance programs more efficiently and mitigate risk effectively, working with a single vendor. We have over 140 energy and utility companies that we serve. It includes upstream, midstream, LDCs, or local distribution companies, municipalities, power gen, and even the refining sector. And through that, we also work with a network of over 7,000 contractors across the nation. A little about today's agenda. As currently outlined, the PHMSA NPRM promises to have a significant impact on the OQ programs of energy and utility companies and contractors that it regulates. Our objective today is to help give you some insight into the expected new requirements and to help you prepare so that you'll be in a better position to comply with those. Here's a look at what we're going to cover in the next hour. First off, we may have a lot of people in the audience who are relatively new to the OQ rule, so Tom will be reviewing some basic information. Next, we'll get into the specifics of the new rule based on the NPRM that was published in 2015 and the updates that PHMSA has given us since that time. Todd is going to give us a really good perspective of what these new requirements are going to mean to the operators and contractors that they affect, both from an operations and a field level. Then I'll share with you some thoughts on what technology can do to help ease the burden of this new regulation. Finally, at the end, we will have some time for questions, so make sure that you submit those. Before we launch into the main presentation, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. First of all, today's event will be about an hour long, and it will be recorded. At the end of the event, we'll email you a link to the archived recordings so that you can view the presentation and listen to the presentation again. And we absolutely encourage you to share this with your colleagues. Please make sure that you disable any pop-up blockers, and feel free to submit questions to our speakers using the Q&A box on your screen. As I noted earlier, at the end of the presentation, we will be taking some of those questions and providing some answers and some clarification where needed. Please also take a minute to visit the Resource Center. We've provided a lot of really good, helpful information in that area for your reference. If you have any kind of technical difficulties, first step is always try to refresh your screen. You can do so by selecting the Control key and the F5 key on your keyboard. If that doesn't work, definitely feel free to reach out to us in the Q&A box on that as well. And with that, I think we should get started. So Tom, I'm going to hand this off to you.
Thanks, Jessica. Let's take a quick look at the current operator qualification rule. Concerns over a number of pipeline incidents, but focus on the qualification of personnel operating the pipelines, and ultimately led to the provision in the laws that govern pipeline safety. On August 27, 1999, the U.S. Department of Transportation's Office of Pipeline Safety publish new regulatory requirements as part of 49 CFR 192 and 195. These regulations have become known throughout the energy and utility industry as Operator Qualification, or OQ Rule. In brief, the OQ Rule requires energy and utility companies to determine the covered tasks for which personnel must be qualified, identify abnormal operating conditions and ensure that qualified individuals can recognize and react appropriately, implement a process for evaluating personnel qualifications that is objective, consistent, and documented, develop and follow a written qualification program, and maintain records to document compliance. The OQ Rule is a recognition that mistakes will be made. The rule aims to ensure the pipeline workforce is qualified to do the work and minimize accidents due to human error and the impact of those when they do occur. We're all interested in avoiding incidents and accidents. Energy and utility companies also face potential penalties if they fail to comply with the OQ Rule. Some individual civil penalties for failure to comply have reached into hundreds of thousands of dollars. For example, a $788,000 fine was assessed in 2010 for an operator failing to identify a covered task, mud plugs, and failing to properly qualify personnel. This chart shows the trend in total dollars and number of civil penalties. The focus for operator qualification requirements is covered tasks. In the current rule, covered tasks is defined by what is known as the four-part test. It's an activity that the company identifies that, first, is performed on a pipeline facility, second, is an operations or maintenance task, third, is performed as a requirement of the regulation, and fourth, affects the operation or integrity of the pipeline. An individual is qualified if they have been evaluated and can A, perform assigned covered tasks, and B, recognize and react to abnormal operating conditions. The rule defines acceptable methods for evaluation. Abnormal operating conditions are those that may indicate a malfunction of a component or a deviation from normal operations that may A, indicate a condition exceeding design limits, or B, result in a hazard to persons, property, or the environment. Span of control is defined as not specifically in the rule, but however, the idea is covered in the requirement to allow for non-qualified individuals to perform a covered task if directed and observed by a qualified individual. And management of change is also not defined, but the rule requires companies to provide for the communication of changes that affect covered tasks to the individual performing them. The regulated company's OQ plan must outline the requirements that its employees must meet, as well as contractors, subcontractors, and any other entity performing a covered task, before they can perform covered tasks on the pipeline facilities. The current OQ rule requires written qualification program, including 7 elements. The company must, first, identify covered tasks to be included in qualification programs. Second, ensure through evaluation that individuals performing covered tasks are qualified. Third, allow non-qualified personnel to perform covered tasks if directed and observed by a qualified individual. Fourth, evaluate an individual if there is evidence that the individual's performance contributed to an incident or an accident. Fifth, evaluate an individual if there is evidence that the individual is no longer qualified to perform a covered task. Sixth, communicate changes that affect how covered tasks are performed to the individuals performing them. For example, company policy and procedure changes, regulation changes, new equipment or technology, or new information from manufacturers. And seventh, identify intervals at which evaluation requalification is needed for each covered task. In addition, companies are required to maintain records to demonstrate compliance with the OQ rule. Who was qualified on what covered tasks, when they were qualified, and how they were qualified.
Now, on to what's changing. Starting with a little background on what has prompted the changes. First, there have been many incidents in recent years in which human error has still been a factor. This has led PHMSA and NTSB to decide that there is need to be some changes in the regulation. In addition, based on PHMSA's discussion with industry stakeholders, gaps have been identified between the OQ rule and actual operations in the field. Although many of these issues have been dealt with in the revised ASME B31Q standard on pipeline personnel qualification, it was determined that PHMSA should amend the OQ regulation to more thoroughly address the gaps. Also, there are deficiencies in the current rule. For example, due to the flexibility of current performance-based rule, it can be difficult to measure compliance. Many operations and maintenance tasks are not specifically called out, so there is room for confusion about which tasks meet the four-part test. And the four-part test omits some very important tasks, such as all construction tasks on new pipelines. In addition, OQ requirements have not been applied consistently across all categories of pipeline. PHMSA is seeking to rectify these deficiencies with the new rule.
At a high level, the new OQ rule is expected to bring an expanded definition of covered tasks so that more tasks are included. It's really a cradle to grave for the pipeline, and more companies are subject to the requirements. A new focus on training as a requirement for qualifying an individual on a covered task, and new requirements for assessing the effectiveness of OQ programs acting on that review. Let's take a look at the specific proposed new updated requirements that are likely to have the most impact. They fall into 6 categories.
First, the proposed changes result in a broader scope. A covered task is defined as an activity identified by the operator that affects the safety or integrity of the pipeline. This includes not only operations and maintenance tasks, but also construction, integrity management, and emergency response tasks. The proposed rule goes on to define emergency response tasks as those O&M tasks that could reasonably be expected to be performed during an emergency to return the pipeline facility to a safe operating condition.
In the proposed rule, the definition of qualified is also expanded. In order to be qualified on covered tasks, an individual must not only be evaluated and able to perform assigned covered task and recognize and react to abnormal operating conditions, the individual must also demonstrate knowledge required to perform the covered task, including variations that may be encountered in the covered task performed due to equipment and environmental differences. Demonstrate technical skills required to perform the covered task, and meet the physical abilities required to perform the specific covered task, such as colored vision and hearing. The proposed rule clarifies the provisions for using non-qualified personnel within specific definition of direct and observe and span of control. In addition, qualification program requirements indicate the span of control limits must be established for each covered task, and record-keeping requirements for program records includes the span of control ratios for each covered task. This is provided to illustrate or clarify the span of control ratio that must be established and followed for each covered task. There's potential that the span of control could go to a limit of 1:1. The proposed OQ rule adds a requirement that operator qualification programs include the provision to provide training to ensure the individual has necessary knowledge, skills, and abilities, KSAs, to perform the task in a manner that ensures pipeline safety and integrity. In addition, as a co-requisite, the individual will be required to know company-specific procedures. The program must also provide a supplemental training when procedures, and specifications for covered task change. A new requirement is proposed to assess program effectiveness and act on the results of the review. Effective program minimizes human error caused by lack of knowledge, skills, and abilities to perform a covered task. Program effectiveness review once each calendar year, not to exceed 15 months. A written program process must evaluate whether the program is being implemented and executed as written, establish provisions to amend the program as necessary to address the review findings. And measures must include, at a minimum, number of occurrences caused by individual whose performance of a covered task adversely affected pipeline safety or integrity due to any of specified deficiencies.
Also added is a requirement that the qualification program establish what is required to be an evaluator, including what training is necessary, and, as part of the measure of program effectiveness, consider any deficiencies due to an evaluator not following the program requirements.
While the current rule requires communication of change that affect a covered task, the proposed rule elevates the requirement to a management of change program, along with related record-keeping requirements. Record-keeping requirements are expanded under the proposal, specifying individual qualification records and program records. Individual qualification records must be maintained that demonstrate compliance with the key provisions of the regulation, in addition to covered tasks qualified to perform, methods and dates of qualification. The company must also document the evaluation to recognize and react to abnormal operating conditions, the name of the evaluator and date per covered task, training required to support individuals' qualifications or requalification, and the individual qualification records must be retained for an appropriate period of time. New for record keeping is a requirement to maintain program records that demonstrate compliance with the key provisions of the regulation, including, at a minimum, program effectiveness, program changes, list of AOCs, program management of change notifications, covered task lists, span of control ratios, reevaluation intervals, and evaluation methods for each covered task. Criteria and training for evaluators, evaluator performance, and the program records that also must be retained for an appropriate period of time.